This is our second time of a series in on transnational feminist translation. It's really an honor for me to welcome the second speaker, who is Dr. Olga Castro. This is, as I said, the second talk. And I'll first introduce myself. My name is Anissa Daoudi. I am a linguist and translation studies specialist at the University of Birmingham. As I said, this series is under the Arabic studies section, and also part of the Translation Studies Research Forum at the University of Birmingham. All of this is also part of 4G Link research stream, which my colleague runs. My colleague Bernie Seb runs. For those who were not with us last week, we have hosted the first talk which was by Professor Louise von Floto, one of the founding members of the Canadian School. And this week, as I said, it's going to be Dr. Olga Castro, one also of the leading researchers in the field. Next week, we will host Dr. Ruth Abu Rashid, who will speak about Iraqi women's stories, rereading their pathways of activism in translation. And the series are all going to be at the same time on Saturday at 6 o'clock, like today. We have the pleasure also of welcoming to our group Dr. Lamia Ben Youssef, who is an academic at the University of Birmingham in the US, not our University of Birmingham, but the one in the US. She will be talking about her talking about her journey as a translator, who was and also she will be giving us like hands-on on what we are talking about, on what feminist translation is all about. The book that she translated is by Ulfa Youssef, the Tunisian scholar Ulfa Youssef, and the book that she translated is called Hiratu Imra'a. And before I move any further, I just wanted to thank Dega and Bisker Lamin for the IT help that they have given us, and for Dega. Without her, I wouldn't have organized these sessions. As usual, we start by introducing our speakers. So I say a thing or two about Dr. Olga Castro, who's an associate professor in translation studies at the University of Warwick. She is the convener of the MA in translation and cultures. Her research focuses on the social and political role of translation in the construction of gender and national identities in the Hispanic world, with a particular focus on transnational feminism, multilingualism, self-translation, and the stateless cultures in Spain. Her recent publications include the co-authored books, some co-authored books, translating women. The latest is Translating Women in the Anglosphere, Activism in Action, Activism in Action. And then the second one is Feminist Translation Studies, Local and Transnational Perspective by Routledge. And Self-Translation and Power, Negotiating Identities in Multilingual Europe, and that was with Palgrave in 2017. She has recently co-edited a special issue on transnational feminist translation studies with the Latin American Translation Journal. As I said, I'm not going to say, there's really a lot to say about Dr. Olga Castro. However, I would like you to Google her up and see her profile for yourself. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Olga. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa. Thank you, Dega, for being there, making this possible. And thank you to everyone who is joining this webinar today. So initially, when I was talking to Anissa about the best way to do this, we thought that an informal talk, an informal Q&A could be a good way. But then I've just decided that I could perhaps break the ice with a brief introduction about myself and my journey, let's say, till where I am at the moment. And then also a little bit about the most recent projects in the field of feminist translation that I have been working on. And what is really important about these projects is that they all were collaborative projects. And it was incredibly productive and enriching, really, to work with other scholars. So that's something I want to tell you a little bit more about in this introduction, and then we can move on and talk about any questions that you may be interested in. So how did everything begin? So in the early 2000s, I was working as a journalist in Galicia. I had done my degree in journalism, but I was finding it quite frustrating. I could see practices of censorship, manipulation of things I was writing or things I wanted to tell, let's say. And so during my BA, I had done an Erasmus year in Britain, in Southampton, which is a special place for Ruth now as well. I was reading about it the other day, that she's affiliated with the University of Southampton. So I thought, oh, a small world. So I had done this Erasmus year in Southampton, and that, in a way, that made me think that translation was really interesting and something beyond the linguistic practice that I had been told in school. So translators translate sentences, that's it, end of the story. So living in the UK as an Erasmus student made me realize translation is mediation, is cultural understanding. And I thought, well, I've got two options really: to stay in the profession and be frustrated by the age of 30, or to try something different. So I did my, my second BA in translation and interpreting. The way it works in Spain, if you have a BA, you can access, let's say, the second cycle, the second part of another BA. So after a few years, I did my BA in translation and interpreting, and I just realized I was here to stay. I was really passionate about it. And I did it with Galician as my main native language. So I could choose Galician or Spanish. And even though Galician is co-official in Spain, according to the 1978 constitution, it is still a minorized language. So Castilian Spanish has like the hegemonic power in the whole of the nation state of Spain. And so there was in Galicia at the time a lot of scholarship about Galician translation studies. So I learned a lot about translation in peripheral literatures, stateless cultures, in non-hegemonic languages. And that was really amazing to see all the things my colleagues in Vigo, the University of Vigo, were doing. But I also realized there was a lack of a feminist approach. And that's something I decided to do in a way in my PhD. So to approach Galician translation studies from a feminist perspective, in a way to disentangle the different layers of invisibility and discrimination of women in relation both to this cultural or national identity and the gender identity as well. So I did my PhD, and then I had to leave because there were no opportunities at all to stay and to work there. So I came to the UK a few months after completing my PhD, and I worked at Exeter, then Aston, now Warwick for the last 2 years. And something that I always, whenever I have the opportunity, something I really want to say, also in relation to a discussion that we had last week with Louise, how expensive it is to do a PhD in some places. Well, luckily in Spain, in state universities like the one where I studied, it's quite affordable, I would say. I remember I had to pay, I'm not sure now, but I had to pay something like 100 euros a year. That was it. So it's not comparable to the amount of money that students have to pay in other places in the world. So that was one thing. And but having to migrate, let's say, I feel I've got like mixed feelings about it, because I cannot pay back the investment that the Galician government, the Spanish state made in my education in a way. So I feel really fortunate that I could do my PhD in a state public university. And I'm just sorry that I cannot pay my taxes back, so that I pay back in a way so that this kind of public education can continue. Sorry, this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's important to say, because it's about access as well to academia. And then if I'm mentioning migration as something important, well, it is important, I would say nowadays more than it was when I moved 10 years ago, not only because of my identity as an EU migrant in Britain, especially in this Brexit land, but also for two more reasons. One, migration had always been part of my identity. My parents were migrants in Switzerland, and all my uncles and all my aunts had migrated in the 60s and 70s due to the extreme poverty in Galicia under Franco's regime, Franco's dictatorship. So I've got cousins in Switzerland still. So that migration was something really, really important and very core to me. But also migration from a more academic perspective, because it has been a journey, sometimes quite painful in a way, this academic journey, when you come from a different academic tradition. So what I found when I came to the UK was the expectations about academic writing were very different. I'm not talking only about the language itself, but what is considered good research, how do you structure a paper, how do you talk about the objectives and the aims and the research questions and all those things that were almost completely alien to me. And especially today that English is becoming the lingua franca, I fully understand how difficult it is for many colleagues who are not part of the Anglo-Saxon, let's say, academia, to get published in English and to be able to write in English. And as we said, it seems that you have to write in English to exist, which is really unfair. It shouldn't be like that, but to some extent it is. And last week, Louise van Vloten was talking about all the editing work that she had been doing for the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Gender and Feminism. So that's it. I mean, it's a really long journey when you come from a different tradition to be able to publish in English. So the hegemony of English is something that should be challenged. And then we can talk more about it if you want. So after telling you a little bit about myself and my journey, to explain who am I and where I am at the moment, I want to tell you a little bit more now about the kind of collaborative work that I've been doing over the last few years. Because, well, I think the publications themselves are good contributions to the field, but the best part of these collaborative projects is how enriching, how productive the collaboration itself was, and to some extent, how these collaborations forced me to go outside my comfort zone and to challenge previous assumptions in a way, and to be open to new ideas. That was really productive. So the first book I want to talk about the first collaboration is with Emek Ergun. And the book that we published together in 2017, you mentioned it before, Anissa, is Feminist Translation Studies, Local and Transnational Perspectives. So the first interaction I had with Emek was she sent a proposal for an article for a special issue that I was working on in the journal Gender and Language, and I was doing a special issue on translation. So when I was reading her proposal and then her article, I had this very weird experience, like, is it me writing this? I mean, the kind of connection, I could have written everything she wrote in that paper. Well, apart from the examples were in Turkish, and I don't speak Turkish, but the approach, everything, it was like intellectual chemistry, we call it. So I just, I got in touch with her and I said, look, should we do something together? And it was, it was like love at first sight. And we started working together on this. We started working together on the book in 2014. So it took us 3 years to get it out. And when we were working on the book proposal, something that we emphasized was that for the last 15 years, so 2014 backwards, there had been virtually no publications in English with the F word. Of course, everybody knows Louise von Flotow's Translation and Gender, Translation in the Era of Feminism, 1997. But after that, very, very few examples of books about translation and feminism. A lot of books, well, not a lot, some books about women, about gender, but not the F word. And for us, this was a political perspective that should be there, and we wanted to emphasize all the activism around it. And then, of course, we wrote the book proposal, and 2 books with the word feminism came out that very year. So, it was the book Translocalidades, Translocalities, Feminist Politics of Translation in the Latin/Latina Americas, which is an amazing book edited by a group of women, among them Zoni Alvarez and Claudia da Lima Costa, among others. And also the special issue in Science, which is titled Translation, Feminist Scholarship and the Hegemony of English. So these 2 publications were like breaking, let's say, groundbreaking in the field. And we wanted to carry on that tradition by putting feminism on the book cover, let's say, of the book, and at the center of the politics of translation studies. The second gap that we wanted to address was that we could feel an emerging geographical and interdisciplinary diversity within the field. On the one hand, a geopolitical growth, so more contributions about feminism and translation, gender and translation, contextualized or framed in contexts beyond the Western world. But also, and that was a very important point, also publications in other languages which were not English. Languages that we cannot read, but it's important that we acknowledge that exist, even if we cannot read it. So we could, from French, we could see that there were a lot of publications in Chinese, also in Arabic, in Eastern European languages, And that was important to acknowledge. And then about the interdisciplinary diversity, even though traditionally feminist translation was focusing on literature, a little bit of linguistics, and let's say a little bit of history or historiography of translations, or recovering women translators that had been forgotten, we could see that nowadays we couldn't talk of feminist translation studies and just focus on literary text. So that was a very limited understanding of what feminist translation is. And so the ethical dimension there was very important. Now, that was about the gaps. And the other thing I wanted to mention about this project, what was important about this project, is that I am, and I was at the time, a translation studies scholar. That's my identity, let's say. I work at the translation studies department. Emek Ergun, she's got a translation background. She did a BA in translation back in Turkey, but she is a scholar in gender studies. First, she was working at Baltimore, and now she's working at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Both of us, we have a shared experience of migration, and we also had some, very common, let's say, interests. But what was really, really revealing is that we were getting there from different perspectives and after having done different readings. And that was crucial. So when trying to reflect critically about translation, about feminist translation studies, we realized there was a lack of dialogue between academics in translation studies departments, very often in Europe and the UK. Well, geographically, the UK is still Europe, so I'm going to say Europe. Perhaps because of, the multilingualism in Europe as a continent, and also because translation does have a higher status in Europe. I mean, you get departments of translation, whereas in the States, it's more translation, more often than not, I would say, is part of comparative literature departments or linguistics. So that was one aspect. So academics in translation studies departments that were interested in approaching their areas of study from a feminist perspective. That was me, for example. Or scholars of translation studies who were selecting areas of study according to feminist criteria. They were focusing on feminist books, they were focusing on women authors, and women translators, but that was the main aspect. On the other side, we realized there were academics in feminist or in gender studies departments, especially in the US, doing transnational feminism. And transnational feminism, I mean, we can discuss the label transnational if you want. I remember there were some questions about it last Saturday. So transnational feminism that focuses not only in challenging patriarchy, but also in challenging power differences within women and within feminisms in the world. So transnational feminism, the 99% feminism as opposed to liberal feminism or this neoliberal, let's say, feminism based on neoliberal individual success of some women, also based on white supremacy very often. So for transnational feminism, feminist alliances and transnational networks are crucial. They are key. And then, of course, if you are trying to think transnationally about alliances between different women, you need translation. So translation is a key mechanism to allow for those dialogues and for those cross-border alliances between women across the world, let's say. So these were like the two perspectives that were coming in this book. The translation studies scholar who was interested in feminism, and the transnational feminist scholar who was very interested in translation. And actually, Emek is a translator herself as well. And then, of course, some aspects that maybe we can discuss later about transnational feminism, and aspects that we still need to talk about is the lack of language diversity and what's the space for minorized languages in these alliances, because more often than not, hegemonic languages are used, and some communities and women have to use hegemonic languages if they want to be able to interact with other women as well. But just to summarize, the book was an attempt to create dialogues between scholars like me and scholars like Emek. We wanted the book to be useful for translation studies scholars interested in feminism, and for transnational feminist scholars interested in translation. And that's why we decided to ask Patricia Hill-Collins for a preface, and also why we came up with this idea of having a cross-disciplinary round table on the feminist politics of translation. So we invited scholars from different disciplines to talk about translation as a political praxis to allow feminism and to allow activism in feminism. Kathy Davis, Judith Butler, Ana Louise Keating, Claudia Dalima Costa, Sonia Alvarez, Richa Nagar, and Aizgul Altinai collaborated with us. They would not contribute a chapter, but they were happy enough to answer some questions. So we edited that. And I think that roundtable is just very powerful in the book. And then, of course, all the chapters. We are very grateful to all the contributors. Now, second project I would like to discuss more briefly, because I've already told you a lot about the foundations of transnational transnational feminist translation. But the second project I wanted to mention briefly is an article that I wrote with Maria Laura Espoturno from the University of La Plata in Argentina. So Luis van Vlotto put us in touch. Laura and Luis were talking about writing or editing a special issue about transnational feminist translation for Mutatis Mutandis, which is an open source journal of translation, the Latin American Journal of Translation Studies. And so Luis put us in touch, and then the four of us, Emek, myself, Luis, and Laura, we worked on this special issue together. And that was incredibly productive, because everybody, I mean, each of us were coming from a different country and from a different background as well. So the kind of dialogues that we had were really, and challenges as well that we were putting on the table, like, okay, but now how would you answer this from your perspective? So that was incredibly enriching as well. And then something very important for us, when we agreed that Mutatis Mutandis was the right venue for this special issue on transnational feminist translation, is that it is an academic, free, open access, and multilingual journal, which is not something you can find that easily, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, academic world, let's say. So it's free, it's open access, and it's multilingual, which is great. It's based in Colombia as well. So that was a way of contributing to the production and circulation of knowledges in the so-called global South. And then working, when we were editing this special issue, we received an amazing lot of proposals, and we were just, at some point, we were considering maybe editing a second issue, because there were, really good proposals, but we couldn't fit them all in just one issue. So, well, in the end, something we also realized is that proposals that were not coming from the Anglo-Saxon world were offering very different understandings of the term transnational. So there was what Laura and I called una indeterminación conceptual, a conceptual indetermination. So transnational means many different things. And we wanted to emphasize, we wanted to explain what it means to us and for us as well. So the aim of this chapter that we wrote in Spanish was to offer a comprehensive methodological framework, let's say, for transnational feminist translation from a situated position. These are the languages we speak, and this is what we can read, and we also acknowledge our blind spots, let's say. We don't know everything which is going on in the field, but this is what we know, and this is what we think about it. We wanted to emphasize intersectionality as well, to explain how the different interlocking systems of oppression interact with each other. And most of the examples were from Latin America, from the Iberian world. And by Iberian, I mean, well, the multilingual and multicultural Spain, and also North American settings. And we wanted, towards the end of the article, we want to, or what we do is to make like a proposal so that others can take it further and apply it both in theory, in the practice of translation, and pedagogically when we teach translation. So those are the three aspects that we cover. Now, what is important about this project, right? Both of us, Maria Laura Espoturno and myself, we are translation studies scholars. I'm from Galicia, based in the UK. She is from Argentina, right? So what was the clash here? The clash was the use of the categories global north and global south. So categories that for those of us working in the north, in the global north, let's say, are or work quite well, scholars from the global south are not so happy about them. So the discussions with Maria Laura were really challenging in the sense of, okay, this terminology, it's not working. We may use it, but we have to address it as well. We have to emphasize decolonial feminism, for example, in Latin America, which is something that when we adopt the term transnational that comes from the US, transnational is wide enough to embrace the colonial feminism, of course, but the choice is important. So these were the kind of debates that Laura and myself were having. And for me, it was incredibly interesting to be able to reflect about all these aspects and to discuss them with somebody from the global south. And yeah, so that was incredibly productive, let's say. And now with Helen Vasalo, that's the third project. That's in 5 minutes and I'll finish. Helen Vasalo. So with Helen, we had been colleagues in the year 2010 when I first came to the UK. I said before I worked at the University of Exeter for 1 year. She was already working there, and we knew each other. And then Helen started working on the topic of translating women, and mainly trying to create synergies with the publishing world. So she is an academic, of course, but she's also an activist. And in fact, she's got this amazing blog, Translating Women, where she publishes reviews of books authored by women who have been translated into English. So if you browse her blog, that's like an amazing catalog. If you want to read more women in translation, just go to her blog, read the reviews, and you will find something that you can say, yeah, this is something I would be interested in reading. Right, so we started discussing, okay, what can we do together, applying this transnational feminist translation approach. And then we decided it would be really, really useful to discuss and study and analyze what is being translated into English from a transnational feminist perspective. So the question is no longer whether women authors are being translated, but which women authors are being translated, from which languages, from which literary traditions. Do they, what's their identity in an intersectional, from an intersectional perspective as well? I'm talking about race, class, religion, ethnic diversity, sexual identity, gender identity, etc. All these questions. And that's something we did in the chapter that we published in the Routledge Handbook of Translation Women, Translation, Gender and Feminism, the one that Hala Kamal and Luis Van Flotto edited together. So we published that, looking at what is being translated into English, which women writers are being translated into English, but not only numerically, but you know, where do they come from, and what are the gaps? What are the spaces, the languages that we cannot read in English yet? And of course, minority and minorized languages are key here. So we decided to organize a conference, and that was in the year 2019, at the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. We got funding for that from the Institute. That was amazing. And what was really important about the project is that what was challenging for me as well, and that what made me go outside my comfort zone, is that the conference aimed at creating synergies between academia and the publishing world. So sometimes we working in academia, we tend to read each other's work, but we tend to forget. We are in our ivory tower, let's say, and we tend to forget what's happening down there. I mean, what is happening with the stakeholders? What is happening with the people actually doing the translations? And what are the challenges that publishers face? You know, what are the difficulties that translators championing women writers are facing as well? And sometimes authors who want to be translated, and you can see, you know, all the difficulties and all the barriers that they experience. So after the conference, we edited a research book that was published by the Institute of Translation and Interpreting. And again, this was a very conscious choice, because the book is available online. So you don't have to pay for it. You have to register with the ITI, which is the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, but you can read the book for free. And so it has a selection of the papers that were presented at the conference. Yeah, so I think that gives you an overview of, you know, how productive it was to work with Emek Ergun, with Maria Laura Spoturno, and with Helen Vasalo. And at the moment, because I've loved it so much that I want to carry on doing this. So I'm working with Beatriz Barbosa Guimarães from Santa Catarina in Brazil. We're working together in a book chapter in which we are introducing the perspective of queer translation studies as well at the moment, which is again something that all the discussions that I'm having with Beatriz are really productive and stimulating and insightful for me. So I really love working with other people, and I'm learning so much from all these wonderful colleagues that I've been lucky, you know, to be able to work with. I can't hear you, Anissa. Anissa, I can't hear you. I think
now I have unmuted. Thank you so much for this really fascinating journey that you took us to. It's really fascinating, and actually, that's the exact. These are the exact reasons that made me contact you in the first place. And I'm so grateful to you. As soon as I sent you an email, you replied enthusiastically, and you said yes. Let's go. Let's do it. And from it's actually you who has encouraged me to take this to organize this series. And then I contacted Olga, and after that Lemia bin Yusuf. So the four of us, I think, we will come up with something I'm sure more than these series that we're organizing. So thank you so much for that. And I could actually interact with you on so many levels. When you talked about the guilt that you felt for your country, that you could not give back. I feel with that. I live with that. I feel this. I think particularly now with this, I think the lockdown has enabled us to just think, and like we were always like we were just rushing through the work with if we're not supervising, we're teaching and so on. But I felt the same thing actually. I felt like I wanted to give something back to my people or my country, and that's why I organized in the summer a series of talks and so on. So, and also I could really, I was reading your book, and in your book you say without feminist translation, there wouldn't be any transnational feminism, because they needed the language to basically interact with each other. And I wanted to also tell you something, that whenever I get proposal from students wanting to work on feminist translation, and they say, okay, like the first book I give them is your book on feminist translation. Honestly, and it's not, c'est pas un compliment. So I wanted also to ask you about the journey of editing the book. Mm-hmm. By just basically you dealt with and you edited chapters for not really big names. You gave the platform to young scholars, to early career scholars, as well as, of course, others who were at different levels in their careers. So that in itself, for me, is an act of enabling. I wonder whether you could say something about that, and also what have you learned from that journey? What is it that you came out with?
Right, you're talking about the 2017 book, right?
Yeah, and actually, even exactly. It can be applied to the latest one.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, Anissa, because it's gonna give me the opportunity to talk about how difficult it is to make a proposal like this when you haven't published in with renowned publishers before.
Yeah.
So both Emek and myself, Emek was still finishing her PhD, and I hadn't published much in English in the kind of publishers that you would expect in the Anglo-Saxon academia, let's say. So we got when we sent our book proposal, it was a long and also painful journey at the beginning. So we felt that some of the reports that were written about the proposal were questioning our ability to do the book, because none of us were native speakers of English to begin with. So we had to work really hard to convince the publisher that trust us, we will be able to do a good job. It's in our own interest, because we don't want to publish a book that is going to be remembered as something not or something which is not good enough, let's say, that doesn't have good quality. But that was an extra effort, let's say, that maybe if you have a name in the field, you don't have to go through that. Well, that was our impression at the time. So something they also wanted was not just the abstracts of the different topics, but or the different chapters, but how they would create a narrative in the book, which is something really difficult to do before you read the actual article or chapter, the whole thing. So again, we had to prepare a second. We were given the opportunity to resubmit, and we worked really hard to try and convince them this is a project worth doing. And then with the kind of proposals that we got, we realized we had to make well, it's like everything in life, right? You have to make choices. Yeah. So we realized that we got really interesting proposals from a lot of interesting proposals from very few geopolitical contexts. And because for us, it was very important to keep a balance and to allow, for new voices as well, because we were claiming the field is growing and we want to publish authors that have not published in English before, so that it is, this book is read and new approaches and new research is known in the English-speaking academia. So that was a challenge in that sense, because we had to make sure that the proposals we received and then the articles that we sent to Routledge had the minimum standards according to the conventions in English-speaking academia. So I don't believe research done in English is necessarily better. I mean, I'm talking about the conventions, right? I don't think it's necessarily better. It's just different. When you write an article in Spanish, in German, in French, the way you structure the topic is different. The way you talk about it is different. So it was not just a linguistic question, but also a question of how do you approach the topic so that it makes the cut, let's say, and the publisher is going to be happy. So that's something that we were very aware of. And by introducing a preface by Patricia Hill Collins and by introducing this round table chapter with the big names, we thought that is going to be our strategy to give us legitimacy as well, and to prove to the publisher that, yes, this book is worth publishing.
I can, yes, definitely it is worth it. And I'm so grateful to you that you included Arabic you made sure that Arabic is included. You have, I think, 2 articles on Arabic. So for my students, definitely, if you haven't bought the book, go and buy it. I think
and so just to say, Ruth has a chapter there as well.
She has a chapter, yeah.
A very good chapter, yeah.
Exactly.
And she can tell you more. I mean, maybe if you want, she can tell you more later about the process of editing, right? And all the, the back and forth, all the communications that we were having as well. I think it was a lot of work, but I'm really, really happy with the final results, let's say. So I don't know if Ruth would like to
maybe
add
Ruth,
something.
if you can, please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really brilliant talk, Olga. And it was just so fascinating to hear about that background, because I suppose the first time I came across your work was when I wandered into a lecture at the University of Manchester, sometime in 2011, 2012.
And I missed my train back, Ruth, because
yes,
because we kept talking and talking after the talk, and when we realized it was too late.
Yeah, and I suppose I'd come myself from, working in an NGO, or charity sector background, thinking about whether this charity sector background could be of use within what, quote what you said, the ivory tower of academia. And one of those learning points, these crucial points, and I think it's something, and I think your talk will be for others as well, it was one of the crucial hinge points, me deciding, yes, I'm going to go for it. But yes, I think when you're talking about, I've got the book here, as a memory, this is the Feminist Translation Studies, Local and Transnational Perspectives. It can be, I think, for people who are particularly early career researchers or people in the process of research, it can be a very intimidating process to think about what I'm going to publish something, I want to share my knowledge. And when you see something that says Feminist Translation Studies and Routledge, you think, it's a big, as you said, it's a tall order to go. To live up to. And what I think is the crucial thing, maybe think about the ideas of authorship and translation or authorship, is really the editor. The editing is very much part of that, is that collaboration process. And it made me think, that process made me think about how it was just amazing how you as editors work to address inequalities that are involved in the process of making something acceptable within an Anglo, possibly American, English situation, word count, what the publishers want, what the costs are, even things like, can you include pictures or not when you want to illustrate a point which is really important about a particular author, a particular translator. It was, for me, this was the intersection of academia and activism, and I would say intersectionality in action, and I was really honoured to be part of that process. So yes, it was. It took a lot of work, but the process of it really taught me what I thought feminist translation activism could really be about in an academic context. So that was, and I'm sure that any other editors or other writers involved with your work would have said the same. But it was an extremely rewarding process, and I'd say for any early career scholars who are thinking of publishing in this vein, really just keep going, persevering. If you get a response back where you've got to change things, it's carry on and do this. Particularly if English isn't the first language, or academic English is not your first language, just keep with that process, because it's only through these types of alliances, as Olga said, that the voices of the people that you feel so passionate about in your research will get a platform. It can be one of the few venues. So yes, that was my process. I just thought it was very much feminist translation activism it was in action.
Practice in action, yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely, yeah, it's and I'm sure this is like this. These are all positive comments to our students who are present here and who are definitely waiting for to ask you some questions. I have.
Lisa, could I just ask?
Sure.
Because I think there's one concept I just would really love Olga to mention about, because there was one article collaboration which you didn't mention, and because I think it was because you're focusing on your 3 books, but there was, you and Olga also wrote I think what I call a seminal article. It's called Translation Feminism for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Politics, and it's edited by John Evans, Ruela Fernandez. It came out in 2018, and it was there that I thought you launched the term intersectional feminist translation studies. I just wonder, I know the time could be limited, but could you please, for the sake of everyone here, so we know where you're coming from, could you explain, I think many of us know what intersectionality means, and we know what feminism means in our own way, and feminist translation studies. But I found your concept of international feminist translation studies is inspirational, it's very practical, but I also think it can be a game changer in the way that we approach working from, to use your term, peripheralized locations and perspectives. Could you explain a little bit about how you and Emmett conceptualize this term, or what it means in the context of feminist translation studies?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that was a book chapter commissioned by Ruela Fernandez and John Evans for that Routledge book of translation and politics. And one of they gave us a kind of a structure, which was great because it made us think about where the challenges were and what's the future of the discipline, let's say. So we realized again that very often feminist translation that was being done in European settings, in translation studies departments, were focusing on gender only. And that was for us problematic. Because of course, as we know, it's gender, yes, but it's never gender alone. So it's gender with other kind of layers, identities, categories, etc. And so especially race, it's something that we were missing, and that till now it's still missing to a large extent. I know that there is a scholar working in the US who published a chapter in the Translating Women book that I mentioned before with Helen Vasalo. Her name is Corinne Tachiris, and she's working on a monograph about translation and race. I'm really looking forward to that, because it's a big gap that we have in translation studies right now. And that's something that we came across as well when reviewing previous scholarship in feminist translation. So yeah, that article, that book chapter, offers a perspective about the main developments in feminist translation in translation studies from a feminist perspective. And that's when we noted there is a lack of intersectionality, and it's we need to discuss gender, but not only gender. And as you said, Ruth, it's very important this for the kind of ethnic minorities and minorized languages as well, which is one of the blind spots still in transnational feminist scholarship. There is an article in the 2017 book, Feminist Translation Studies, by Maria Reimondez. She is a scholar from Galicia as well, where she talks about polyphony, how feminist translation must be polyphonic, so that all languages can be set on equal footing, if you want. So they all have to be at the same level, which is not happening at the moment. So yes, intersectionality is crucial.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you for the really interesting question. What I wanted to say is, I don't know if we could have Lamia Ben Youssef to say a word, because she's hi Lamia.
Yeah. Hi. Do you hear me?
And we do.
Yes.
Yeah. Can we see you, or you just want to speak? Voice only?
Let me see. I don't know why you cannot see me. I'm having problems. But sorry about that. Thank you so much, Anissa, for organizing this event. Thank you, Olga, for this brilliant presentation. I was really hit by your insightful argument about translation and migration. Of course, it has been there, but I've never thought about it. That's really, it hits you. That argument hit me like a lightning. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about that.
About how migration,
relation between migration and translation. I've never thought of it, but it's right there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, there are. The first thing I would do is to recommend some readings by Loredana Polezzi. She is one of the big names working on migration and translation. She's in the States now. She used to work at Cardiff University in Wales. Mm-hmm. So migration and translation, it's to some extent migration. Migrants have to translate themselves all the time.
Yeah.
So it's not just the linguistic aspect of the translation, but the cultural aspect of it as well. And when you think about authors that are publishing, writers that are publishing books based on their experience of migration, you can see how, I mean, cultures are not static concepts, let's say, but there is always this this connection, this kind of inside dialogue, let's say, between the different cultures that one experiences whenever migration is involved, let's say, in this aspect. Now, about the practical aspects, for example, when translating works by authors in migration, there is this very the fascinating aspect of how do you translate that experience to a new audience, because when the writer writes about that experience of migration, he or she is already connecting two worlds, and how that connection is taken to a different audience, so that it's not lost, let's say, so that the nuances of this migration is not lost. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect that could be also in relation to these transnational practices of translation, I think it has to do more with the kind of collaborations that can be, or cross-border collaborations that can be produced by migrants as well. Migrants are bilingual beings, bicultural beings as well, but bilingual beings. And so they've got a key role in enabling these dialogues between, in this case, women from different geopolitical contexts. So the whole aspect of migration is massive, but I've just pointed at two key questions that I think are always present when migration and translation are discussed from a feminist perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure, Lamia, you must have gone through this when you were translating your book or Yusuf's books. I'm sure you have.
Yusuf, yeah,
I'm sure you have gone through.
I'll think about it for my talk. I've never thought about it until today. Thank you, Olga, and thank you, Anissa.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Lamia.
Yeah.
I also have some students who were really keen to ask you some questions. I have Ali Shangiti, who's my student, and he has a question, I think, to ask you. Tfaddal, Ali.
Hi, hello. Do you hear me?
We do, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, hi. First, I would like to thank you about this grateful presentation. I really got a lot of information regarding the feminist translation studies. Actually, I work on humor by feminist Arab writers as a strategy to challenge political, social issues, and also to challenge the religious institutions. So my question is that, do you think that through feminist translation, there is a scope for impacting their societies?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, what interests me about feminist translation is how powerful it is to change the world, if you want. I mean, it's perhaps it sounds like this is utopia, I don't know, but that's what really interests me about feminist translation. So, I mean, the role of translation in changing the world has already been discussed and argued. And of course, the role of feminism in changing the world is key as well. So we just have to think about how important translation is nowadays. I mean, everything around us is a translation. Take the cereal pack that you have for breakfast in the morning, or read the biscuits or something, and you will find a translation there. It may seem that, oh, that's not important, but it is, because ideologies are conveyed, all the time. And then focusing on literary translation, absolutely. Choosing some texts to be translated is a powerful mechanism to to influence in the world as well. It's a powerful mechanism for transnational feminism as well, because in the end it allows for these dialogues and connections and alliances between different groups of people. So, and it's traditionally one of the important areas, I would say, in the established field of feminist translation studies. So the selection of certain books to be translated, and these books could be, just literary projects, but very often we are talking about philosophical texts as well, feminist authors. And by enabling those authors to speak to a new audience, you can achieve two things. One, to challenge previous assumptions about that culture, for example, and two, to allow for these dialogues and also for connectivities, also for commonalities, if you want. Aspects that may seem, oh, this is very specific to our culture. Well, perhaps other women, other people in other contexts are going through similar processes, and by knowing more about them, we can find perhaps answers to the problems and to the questions we have. So in short, my answer is yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. And recently I was on Zoom with Ali, and he basically read your book and summarized it beautifully. So definitely, I think for his theoretical framework, definitely there is scope there. There is also Mukili or Mukil Kansongo. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. So please go ahead. And apologies for not reading your name correctly.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Dr. For your allowing me to speak. Dr. Olga, I'm really happy to be here and to be able to speak to you and ask you this question. I'm also a PhD at Birmingham, working on a feminist approach to my translation analysis to my dissertation. I have a good question, because I'm looking at Francophone African women translated into Russia, sorry, Soviet Russia. And my question is that when I look at the translation data, I can see them as feminists, But when I interview the Russian women translator, obviously they work in the Soviet times, they don't see any link to feminists to their own work. So my question to you is, can this be called a feminist translation practice as we know it now, even if those women don't see any link to feminism? That's my question.
Yeah. What you can certainly do is to apply a feminist analysis to the topic, let's say. I mean, all kinds of interactions, processes, texts, etc., can be analyzed from a feminist perspective. You don't need the affiliation of the authors or of the translators with feminism in order to be able to do this analysis. That would be the first part of the answer. So I do think that your approach is very valid, and that you can still propose this theoretical framework for this analysis. The second part of the answer has to do with the fact that the Russian translator, if I'm not mistaken, the Russian translator doesn't feel this affiliation with feminism. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So something I would say really interesting to try and find out is the reasons why that is happening. I don't know a lot. I don't know enough about the Russian context when the book was translated. But in other contexts, what happens often, not often, sometimes, is that feminism is seen as something from the West. And so there is a rejection of the term because it seems like this is going to be imposed on us. That's not true, and that's something that, you know, those of us in the West have to acknowledge this and have to realize that we cannot impose our way of thinking in other places. But there is feminist scholarship, I would say, everywhere in the world, but maybe coming from different perspectives, because feminism is about finding answers to specific questions and that affect women, and those questions are going to be linked to the specific cultures. So something for you to do perhaps is to try and reflect about the reasons why this translator doesn't want to be affiliated with feminism. And she can have very valid reasons, but you can still, in my view, do a feminist analysis of the topic. I don't know if that's helpful, but
yes, very helpful. Thank you so much.
I would say carry on, of course, making this explicit, but carry on, because yeah, feminism as a framework, let's say, can be applied to any kind of object of study.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I can't agree more. We have the same thing in most of the Arab world. When they find the word feminism, it's something that came from the West, and it's something that is huge automatically. There is that assumption that it is automatically against religion, against tradition, and so on. So, for example, if I talk about Algeria, I always refer to Algeria. The feminist activists there really suffer all kind of discriminations, all kind of to the point that sometimes they risk their lives. They put their lives out there, and so I understand that it might not be like as easy as we might take it here in the West. There is Ghassan.
I think Ruth wanted to say something.
Yes, just to illustrate that point, because you talked about, as you mentioned to very eloquently to Mokile just before, it's not necessarily about affiliation, it's about your practice as a scholar. And I suppose the perspectives in which you understand feminist translation to be, whether it be from an intersectional perspective, it could be a linguistic perspective, geopolitical perspective. It's about where there are situations of women in different cultures, but in different locations. It could be that the lack of affiliation could be for political reasons, could be for ideological reasons. It could be that they feel that it's not relevant for their particular context. And I think one I found particularly useful in the Iraqi context was that the reason why, for example, the feminist translation, feminist literature was such a productive way of research by male scholars, because it shed light on what was happening on different social groups within an Iraqi and an Arab world and a wider world context. So what can affect women actually politically affects us as men. What is happening to children, what's happened to people across generations, it affects us. So, but to do that, it's useful to have a theoretical perspective, a feminist translation, however you define it, as a point of departure. It's as long as you make that clear that you are not assigning a particular ideology to the translator or the author. I think then, as long as you make your positionality clear, then you can just see where the creativity of your analysis can lead you. And the whole point, I think it's something which Olga was brought up in her books, is that it was something, I think whether it was maybe Patricia Hills Collins brought up, she said the whole point is that knowledge is incomplete. I don't know if you want to add to that, Olga.
Well, yeah, basically to say that we should always acknowledge, I think, our own positionality as researchers. And to understand that situated knowledge is the only thing we can do. So from that perspective, if you make clear what your position is as a researcher, I think the feminist framework and methodology is absolutely valid. And just to add to the list of reasons that Ruth was mentioning now, possible reasons why the translator was not affiliating herself with feminist translation. I mean, nowadays, 2021, I don't think feminist translation is received in a better way, let's say, as an academic discipline and also as a practice, let's say. So right at the beginning, feminist translation was seen was being seen as something defective, something that was wrong, something that you were hijacking the texts, you were manipulating them, as if you could translate a text without manipulating it in some way. So the ideological mediation is always going to be there. However, there was this really negative connotation about feminist translation, and it may well be that the translator didn't want to be related to that, or didn't want to see her name next to that assumption of what feminist translation is. And yes, just to that, I would say, try to understand the context, the reasons why she may have said that, but carry on with your analysis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olga. Could we have Ghassan Lotfi, please? Ghassan?
Good evening. Do you hear me?
We do, yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Anissa Daoudi and Professor Olga, for your very interesting presentation. I had one question, but Professor Olga brought up the question of the issue of hijacking text. So yes, of course, any act of translation involves manipulation, but the maybe we should raise the question of the limits of the manipulation and the question of ethics. What could you say about that, please? And my question, my other question is about the choice of texts to be translated, and then the role that feminist translators can play in transnational feminism. But I think we should mention too the limits and the hindrances. So for sometimes translators and publishers collaborate, but sometimes publishers have other projects. I'm thinking of Marilyn Booth.
Yes.
And the article she published in Louise Van Flotto's edited book, when she described how the publisher and the author, in this case Raja Asana, the Saudi author, completely thoroughly edited her book, her translation, and so depoliticized and gendered her translation, and produced what Venuti calls a fluent translation. So my question is, how could feminist translators work in such an environment, if you allow me the expression? How could a translator pursue her feminist project when she is not the only one, the only let's say owner of her text, of her product, of the final product? And thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Right, I'm gonna start with the second one, then you will have to remind me of the first one, I think.
Okay.
Just the second one, feminist translators, how could they work to pursue their feminist projects, bearing in mind they are not the only ones, let's say, working in a project? Well, pedagogy, negotiation, that's what we have to do, and that's what feminists do all the time. To negotiate, to see to what how far we can go as well. So it's true that, I mean, sometimes depending as well on how renowned or how much experience translators have, publishers may trust them more or less. Having said that, some publishers, for example, do not allow for prefaces, and we know that writing a preface to a feminist translation is very important.
Crucial.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about negotiation and pedagogy, explaining what's the purpose of what I'm doing. Now, what is a feminist translation? Perhaps it's a good idea to start by that. How can you tell whether a translation is feminist or not? And I think it's very important here to differentiate translation as a process and translation as a product. So as a product, I would say the final product, you have a feminist translation when you can see that the text is materialized both as at a textual and paratextual level. So the text is materialized in such a way that it invites to a reading of the world which is in accordance with egalitarian values, and that helps move forward towards global social justice, I would say. So it's not only gender, but also all the other categories that intersect with gender. But there isn't a list of, there isn't a checklist that you have to go through to be able to say, oh yeah, this is a feminist translation. Well, it's about translation as hospitality as well. So translation, a translation that invites to a reading that is going to help us move towards a better world. A translation that doesn't introduce sexist readings, racist readings, homophobic readings, because sometimes we've got texts that are translated in a way that all these elements are introduced, and sometimes they are introduced in an unconscious way, because we have to think in terms of ideology and how the dominant ideology is conveyed in an unconscious way sometimes, but still it's pernicious. It's not good. So we have to challenge that. We have to make sure that the final product invites to that reading. Now, there could be as many feminist translations as feminist translators, I would say, because feminism is plural, is very rich. There are many perspectives, so there could be many different ways of doing it. There aren't, that's it about the product. And now, translation as a process. How can you tell whether a translation is feminist in this respect? Well, it's important to think about the reflection of the translator. If the translator decides to write footnotes explaining aspects, or includes a glossary, or includes a preface, then you've got some indication that there was a process there. But sometimes, as you rightly said, translators are not allowed. So it's difficult to tell about the process. What can translators do? Well, maybe, in all the translation forums and fora, they can write about it. They can write a blog post explaining the experience. So it's not just the text itself, but feminist translation can be taken beyond the text and even beyond the paratext. Paratext understood also as interviews with a translator, if you want, not just the text surrounding the book itself, but also, making this distinction according to Jeanette, right? The paratext and the hypertext. That's it. Yeah, exactly. So everything you can do when you feel this frustration, I wanted to write a preface. The publisher didn't let me do it. Okay, I'm going to talk about it. And that's a way of A, saying this is a problem and things have to change, and B, talking about what you would have liked to do that you were not allowed. So that could be a way, right? But sometimes, I mean, negotiation is important. Sometimes you can be positively, let's say, your message can be received in a positive way. And I've discussed this anecdote in the past. Once, when I was working as a freelance translator at the time, and I was commissioned the translation of some texts for an exhibition, and the translation was from English into Galician. So the topic was very much about women in history, blah blah blah, and I thought some linguistic strategies would be really important there. But I wanted to avoid a situation in which the commissioner of the exhibition would come back to me saying, "What is this?" So I talked to them from the beginning, and I explained why the translation, having in mind this perspective, why it would be great, appropriate, and the best translation that they could, have. They were a bit suspicious, I suppose, but they said, "Okay, do it, and let me. And then when you submit the translation, we will see." They were really happy about it, and actually, what happened is that they had already commissioned a translation of that text into Spanish. It was going to be a bilingual, the panels were going to be bilingual, Spanish and Galician. So what they did after seeing my translation was to send me the translated text into Spanish, and they asked me to do a proofreading, a feminist proofreading of the text. So it was just an example of, wow, if I hadn't said anything, maybe they may have agreed, but they wouldn't have understood the importance of doing this intervention and the dimension that feminism has for this exhibition as well. So at the end of the day, I earned more money because they paid me for the translation and they paid me for the proofreading. That was the second question. And now, of course, I have forgotten about the first one. But
I'll actually, thank you so much. I'll actually welcome you, Ghassan. Welcome you to this series.
Thank you very much.
And Ghassan, you're from my university. You're from Constantine University, right?
Yes, I teach at the University of Constantine.
Yes, that's where
in the Department of Translation. Yes.
Perfect. That's what I did my BA. I wanted also to come back to Marilyn Booth's article, which I've put in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
I was working, at that time I was working on a postdoc project, working on the language side. And I had that same novel, Banat al-Riyadh, or Girls of Riyadh. And I was looking at the language use. It was really, then it was such a novice way of looking at the language, like a funky language, a girly language, or like where she uses like a hybrid Arabic, something that we usually don't associate with the written form of Arabic. And I had the chance to speak to Marilyn then, because I was surprised when the translation came out. I remember telling Marilyn, like, what did you do to the language? The language was so funny, so witty, so it has that girly side, and it really is the way these girls want to basically disassociate themselves from their society.
It was all gone.
Sorry?
It was all gone according to Marilyn Booth.
Yeah, and she said, well, it's not my fault. And I to the point that I remember telling her, you made it like very Orientalist, like we the Arabs don't have camels and blah. And he was just like, this is not what translation is about. And I remember telling, she was like, she was as angry about the interference of the author as I was. So here is, again, I wanted to say something about how it happened. And I also wanted to link it to what Ruth wanted to say something about Demetrius as well. But please go ahead, Ruth.
Well, and also I think with the particular issue of the Marilyn Booth, article, it's also that there's a politics of privilege as well that was involved. And I think something which was touched on by Professor Louise last week, and also something which Olga talked about, the idea of who are the gatekeepers, what's seen as a contributor to knowledge, which languages. So there was also the fact that, for example, one type of language which an author might wish to share in Arabic, maybe for whatever reason she felt that she did not want to share it in the same way in English, because she's thinking this is a different market. And you can, there's a lot of complexities and layers to this particular case study. But I thought it was interesting because it related to this idea, when Olga was talking about the politics of translating Galicia, I looked at the Q&A and saw Demetrios asked a really interesting question. So I don't know whether you want to take and highlight that, because it sort of relates to what Ghassan was asking. Do you want to, Anissa, summarize the question, or get Demetrios to speak? Because I think it relates very closely to what we've been talking about now.
Maybe briefly, because we have so many questions and so many.
I will try to keep my answers shorter as well. Please, I can talk for hours about the topic, but yes.
What Demetrios is asking here is about, where do you stand on the sexist rule of a lot of European, I'd also say Romance languages, where you have a default masculine, particularly in the plural?
So sorry, say it again. What's the question?
Where do you stand on the sexist rule that a lot of European languages have, and he's put Greek and Spanish included, where masculine, feminine, mixed groups, plural masculine? Should we change that grammatical rule? And what do you say? And I presume he means in translation. What do you have to say about the so-called gatekeepers of languages that are against such changes? And the reason why I was so interested in Demetrius' question was because it related to an issue that happened with the Spanish translator, the Galician translator, when there was a work, I think it was what Maria Romandis was working to translate, use a feminist approach to translate an English book into Spanish. I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And this, I mean, the question at some point, the question was, what do we do with the grammar? Do we change it? Yes, of course. We have to change it. I mean, if we think about languages, in the case of Spanish, for example, until the 17th century, the masculine was not used as the default. We've got examples of literature in Spanish in the 16th century where they were duplicating the feminine and the masculine all the time, and it was all right. It was what they were doing at the time. Then what happened when all these academies of the language were created, and I'm talking just from my very limited knowledge of Spanish, French, let's say the languages that I know the most. When these academies of the language were created, of course, they were only men sitting at the meetings, let's say. So I don't blame them for having said things like the masculine is the worthier gender. It makes sense if you understand the context. But because context is everything, this is no longer valid.
Exactly.
So we have to change the rule. The rule made sense when it was created, but it doesn't make sense anymore. Now, societies change very rapidly as well with some aspects. When I did my PhD, one of the questions I was looking at was this precisely: how to translate into Galician from English with all the different, bearing in mind the different ways in which genders are grammaticalized. That's how I put it. And I was talking in binary terms. It was all about women or men. End of the story. Again, I don't blame myself for having done that 15 years ago. But of course, I would never do it again if I had to write about the topic now, because society has evolved. Non-binary identities are finally, in the discussion, and we have to acknowledge that as well. So here, I think what is really important is to understand the relationship between society and language. So one aspect of it is societies evolve And languages have to be able to describe and reflect those changes. So if you've got men working in maternity words, maybe the word midwife is no longer valid, and we need to, to find something else. And the same could be said about women entering professions that were traditionally male. So that's one aspect. Society changes, and the language has to be able to offer descriptions of that. And the other aspect is the way we speak influences the way we think about reality. And there are lots and lots of empirical studies in cognitive linguistics, for example, analyzing precisely how the way we speak. I mean, we think in grammatical terms, we think through words. So the words that we use matter. And it's not only a question of being politically correct and a question of, I don't want to offend others. No, it's much more crucial than that. It's about the power of words. The way we speak is going to challenge assumptions or to perpetuate and reiterate other assumptions. So let's change the grammar and let's move towards a better world.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add something about Arabic. This has been dealt with in Arabic by few scholars. Al-Ghazami from Saudi Arabia has written a book called Ta'nith al-Lugha, and he has actually 2 books about that. And Yusra Muqaddam has also a beautiful book basically dismantling Arabic grammar. And it's a beautiful book for my Arabic speaking students. It's a really good book. I think it's called Al-Harim Al-Lughawi. And the third one is by Jordanian scholar and a poetess as well, called Abu Risha, Zuleikha Abu Risha. She has also a beautiful book about exactly that. Just to say that this is something that just basically, this is what I see our role here is just to show what, be the gap and basically tell the Arabic, the English speaking word that there is research out there, and it's just because of the handicap of the language. Thank you so much. And I will just quickly move to Alicia Batista, please. Hey, Alicia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for hosting this incredible event. It was a very insightful presentation. I have a question because I'm conducting research on non-heteronormative identities. So shifting from, let's say, traditional historical feminism to the idea that gender identities can be multiple, so including different kinds of identities. And particularly, I am analyzing some books, American books in particular, which deal with these gender identities that do not really exist in my country. I'm from Italy. So they don't really exist, or at least we're not fully aware of them, mainly because of cultural reasons. So my question is, what do you think is the best way to translate such a book with a feminist translation approach when moving across totally different cultures? Like, should the translator shock the reader or be gentle so that these concepts, these ideas can be better accepted by the wider audience?
Right. Thank you very much for this question, Alessia. And can I start answering by asking you another question?
Sure.
What do you think? What would you like to do and why?
Well, personally, I think that shocking is always a good idea, because when I am shocked by something, it kind of sticks into my mind. But I guess that sometimes there are some limitations, for example, by the publishing house or something like that. Or on the other hand, it might be quite hard to read, even for me, to read a book full of footnotes and prefaces and so on. So I might feel discouraged to read that and not face the question at all.
Okay, now my answer is going to be, obviously you have already thought about it carefully, you have considered different options, and I would say that whichever you do is going to be right. Now, there is no single question to this, and you are in a much better position than me to know the readers, the target readers, and also to know the publisher and to see how far you can take it, let's say. One thing, translators across times, let's say, translators have always been key in introducing new knowledge, in introducing new terms, new concepts, and sometimes we need to introduce neologisms as well. So just, it's not to put more pressure on you, but whichever you do is going to be really important for others after you, let's say, because if they read your translation, they can take that as, you know, as a model, let's say, or as a starting point, and then perhaps they can go for the same term that you have adopted. So I'm sorry that I cannot give you a specific answer, but yes, you are doing all the things that should be done to assess the situation, to assess the context, the readers, the publisher, and then I totally agree with you. Shocking is important because when you are surprised, let's say, by something, or a disruptive practice, that's how I've called it. When your strategy is disruption in a way, it's easier to remember. At the same time, it may be seen as aggressive and some readers may not like it. So it could be also interesting to try and produce a translation that has different layers of readings. I mean, that you have that you allow for different, for a different involvement from the readers. Footnotes, okay, some readers don't like them. How about endnotes? Are less disruptive, but if anyone is interested, they could still go to the end of the book and read them. But then, of course, endnotes are going to be read by 10%, 20% of the readers. Same thing with glossaries. Maybe if the publisher allows you to do that, including a glossary, could be a good idea to try and coin new terms as well in Italian. That could be an idea. Just to finish with this, if you would like to discuss specific examples with me, just email me. I would be really happy to do it.
Sure, I'd be very happy to. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of my students will take you on for this offer. I have, that's really generous of you. I have Sarah Garsalla. Is Sarah around? If not, Sarah, yes, please. Yeah, just unmute.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for your presentation. This has been really fruitful, and I would like to ask a question concerning my research. I am working on testimonies, Arabic feminist testimonies. So I am confused on how to balance between these feminist writings from the Arab world and the Western theoretical framework, because the testimonies are well established in Holocaust studies and in Latin America. So I am always confused on how to find the balance from samples from the Arab world and framework from the Western world. So how to balance between these worlds from transnational and feminist perspectives.
Right. Yeah.
And thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And just to say, something you could argue is that Latin American testimonials are not really Western. I wouldn't say, it's not really Western theoretical framework. And that's one of the things I learned working with Maria Laura Espoturno. I realized that sometimes, especially because of the connections that Spain has with Latin America, we tend to think of Latin America as part of the Western world, but it's not necessarily the case, right? So that's one thing. Now, how to balance? I would say the important thing here, as Ruth was mentioning before, is positionality. So you explain how your work is being influenced by previous research. And I see no problem in whichever balance you have. I mean, as long as you are aware of what you are doing and you are justifying it. And one of the key things about transnational feminist, and one of the key things and the paradoxes, let's say, of transnational feminist translation is that it's a call for action in terms of cross-border alliances from different parts of the world, from different perspectives as well. So dialogues, alliances, networks, that's key for transnational feminist translation. And the paradox is that it is itself a theory that was produced in the States. But it was not produced by scholars, let's say, who belong to hegemonic, how to say that, to the hegemonic class or to hegemonic communities. It was produced more often than not by racialized authors who were migrants as well. So it's wide enough so that all kinds of perspectives can find a place there in the discussion. So I don't think it's particularly problematic in this case to apply a transnational feminist translation framework to analyze Arabic testimonials. What I would say is that once you've done your analysis, you will surely identify some of the blind spots of transnational feminism as it exists today, as scholars like me who know nothing about Arabic testimonials haven't discussed. And that's something I'm doing myself. You know, when I'm talking about Galician feminism or Galician women writers, I can see that transnational feminist translation is a great framework that could be enriched by perspectives that from minorized contexts. And that's one of the things I'm really interested in doing now, how working from other contexts can challenge mainstream assumptions in whichever discipline it is. So you do your research and then you go back to the theory and you say, look, something was missing and I have found it when doing this kind of analysis. So, and that's also the way that knowledge is produced, by pointing at the gaps. And of course, no theory is perfect, let's say, no framework is perfect. And the more we apply a framework, the more gaps we can find and the more answers we can provide to fill those gaps.
Sure, that's definitely the answer. Thank you so much, Olga, for this. Maybe if we could take some Q&A, if you go to the Q&A section on Zoom and select, probably you might have answered some of the questions, and well, I'll leave it up to you. Are there any scholarship or funded ongoing research studies concerned with feminist approach in the UK? now or in Canada. Maybe the MC4 probably scholarships. Is she?
Sorry, can you say it again? I was not, yeah, I didn't get that one.
She's asking, are there any scholarships or funded ongoing research studies? And I was thinking of the MC4, if you could maybe say something about that, that would be probably useful. Is this how I understood the question? I don't know whether this is right.
If I can say more about the scholarship.
That's what she's asking, I think, whether there are any scholarships.
Yeah, well, that's the part I like the least about my job, having to see how many really wonderful projects cannot be pursued because of lack of funding in a university system where doing a PhD is so expensive. Which is why I wanted to make a point at the beginning that it cost me like €100 per year, to do my PhD, and I had a scholarship from the government, which is something that, as far as I am aware, that's not a possibility in the UK at the moment. So funding is normally from universities, and the problem is all these programs and funding, the calls for funding, they are so incredibly competitive. I don't want to discourage anyone. Please do try. You won't get it unless you try. But it's really difficult, both at PhD level and also at postdoc level. So it's worth trying. And yeah, there are some kind of call for PhD applications and all that, but it really depends. Very often, it depends on the universities in the UK. That's my experience. I don't know what you think, Anissa. I mean, the University of Birmingham also offers scholarships.
There is this program called the MC.
Yeah, and Warwick is part of it as well.
Warwick is part of it. You need to find a supervisor in, let's say, at Birmingham University, and one, for example, at Warwick University. So there are four
potentially, Anissa and I could work together.
With,
say, for example, because we don't have Arabic expertise at Warwick. We do Chinese and then just the European languages, German, Italian, French, and Spanish. So if anyone wanted to work with me and Arabic, it would have to be through this network there. And, Anissa and I could offer, for example, or Ruth, I mean, anyone with a language expertise, but that is in a university that is part of the program. But you have to, I mean, it's not difficult. If you Google it, you will find it. You can put the link maybe.
MC4. And thank you so much. And it is, as you said, very competitive, really competitive. Like the project has to be like a solid project and so on.
Yeah, another option is to go elsewhere in Europe.
Yes.
And I suppose our employers are not going to be happy, with us saying this, but in many other countries in Europe, doing a PhD is much more affordable. And I will leave it there.
And for the Arab world, what I would also suggest is the split site PhD. The split site PhD, where you do some, you need to spend some time in the UK, and then the rest of the time is in your home country. So this is like a good compromise. I don't know if you could maybe have a look at the next one. Mikil, I think Mikil has asked the question. Bab Spicer. Olga, how can we?
I can't see. I mean, I've got the chat here, but there's so many things going on that I don't know where that is. If you could read it out for me.
Yeah. Olga,
could I just ask, because I think I'm very aware some of our students, especially in different countries, many people doing PhDs, postdocs, are also required to teach, and not just in universities, but in schools, working with people who are under 18. And you talked a little bit about, let's bring in the politics of disruption to shock. But if we're going to use feminist translation studies approaches as a pedagogical tool, where the politics of power means that we're in a position of power, but we're also in a position where we have to be very careful, perhaps self-censoring, because we are teaching in a way a different set of learners. How can, for example, I know many PhD scholars in Algeria, for example, they teach in secondary schools as part of their program. How can we, as a pedagogy, how can we bring feminist translation and practice into our teaching when we are told we have to teach new learners of language in a particular way? The grammatical rule is a grammatical rule, and that's the only way you can do it, even if the children themselves question it. What can we do?
Right, yeah, Ruth, we were discussing this earlier today, right? When students were questioning it. And then, of course, again, context is everything. In my department at Warwick, in the translation, but in the Hispanic studies side of it, let's say, all of us share a similar position about the importance of gender in language. So I always tell students whenever they are translating, I always show them the other possibility. And so sometimes I get this question, but am I allowed to do this? And my answer is always, it depends. If you do it for me in this exam, of course you are. If you don't know who is going to mark the exam, maybe be more conservative. It's about, sometimes we want to be radical because we want to change things. But if it's going to be counterproductive, we don't get anything. So if you're going to face rejection, there is no point in doing it. So analyze the context and then make a decision based on that. That would be my answer. And if you think of Spanish, French with the Royal Academy of the Language, of course they're going to say that's not correct. Well, okay, we know that. We know who they are and what they want. They want to, to keep the privilege that they've got. So I just don't take them seriously. But you have to know, when you can do certain things. So to my students, I always tell them, in my exam, of course you can do that. In my translations, when you translate for me, you can do that. In French, well, I don't know, talk to the teacher, ask, and be safe. That's the key thing.
Thank you so much. And there are two questions that probably we quickly have. I'll read them to you. Can we challenge the lack of diversity in academia in our writings, theses /theses? I'm thinking here of feminist citational practices.
Feminist citational,
yeah, practices, and seeking out and citing diverse voices. I would say yes. Go ahead. Do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was in Birmingham. It was last April. Originally, there was a question about decolonizing the classroom, decolonizing universities. I couldn't attend, but then it was rescheduled, I think. Your colleague Emmanuel Santos.
Oh, yes.
Was one of the organizers. So yes, of course. I mean, that's diversity understood in a very plural way. It's not just gender. It's more things. So it's different layers of oppression that are there. Now, a politics of citation, of feminist citations, I have to admit, I had never thought of that, but yes, why not?
Exactly.
Why not? That's a good way of going around it. Yeah. To increase diversity and also projection of what we do. And I could, as I was skimming through the chat, I could see a question about accessibility. Yeah. And I totally agree with that. I mean, these books that are so expensive, we were talking with Louise last week as well, the Routledge Handbook, how much it costs, and that's 1/3 of the salary for some colleagues working in African countries, in some Latin American countries. How can you afford that?
That's true.
Absolutely. So, and that's the frustrating bit of it as well is that our employers want us to publish in certain journals for certain publishers, and we have to do that because our employers are paying our salary. So we have to, you know, to make sure that we've got publications in the right place. Now, what we do with the other publications, it's our business, and we can perhaps combine a little bit of both, which is why, you know, when the opportunity came to publish this special issue in Mutatis Mutandis, I said yes straight away. Free, open access, great. And then something, because I could see that Luciana Carvalho was also, she's left now, but she was also attending. And Mutatis Mutandis, they published this special issue in January 2020 about Transnational Feminist Translation. But then the next issue was on women and translation in the Latin America. And she was one of the editors as well. So the journal showed a lot of commitment with the issue as well, which is great, right? And yeah, so that's one of the key things. And I've seen that the name of Sepnan Susan Sarayeva was also mentioned about migration, of course. I forgot to mention her work. She works at the University of Edinburgh, and she's been working recently about birth experiences and how migration is also key when retelling or when talking, you know, through the birth process, let's say, when you are not a native speaker of the language. So I can only recommend her work as well.
Thank you so much. This is the last question, which is, it's a question by Abdal Goksenim Abdal, and he says, how do activists' definitions of translation vary from one to another in your observation, and how do they position themselves in the fields of publishing, I mean, as cultural agents or as feminist mediators? It's actually quite a long...
Well, I was going to say, should we stay for another hour? Yeah, I mean, the question itself is great.
Yeah.
The answer could be, I'm afraid I won't have a great answer if I have to keep it short. But yes, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned before, feminism it's very diverse. It's a plural, it's a methodological framework, and it's got a part of, I mean, it's about activism, of course, but depending on your specific area of work, activism can be done in different ways. The last project that I mentioned before, the one with Helen Vasalo, the title is Translating Women, Activism in Action. And here, activism was about translating more women writers into English. Because, I mean, we all know that translation into English accounts for 3, 4, 5% of what is being published in English, so a tiny fraction. And then within that tiny fraction, only around 1/3 of what is published in translation is written by women writers. So activism here is about getting more women writers published. But then, of course, activism goes a bit beyond that, and it's like, okay, let's identify what geopolitical contexts are not still represented in English translation. So activism is not just women. Now it's activism plus something else. So you could combine all kinds of you know, areas of interest, and to be an activist in that. Something that has been said about small publishers in the UK, particularly, they are the ones publishing translated literature. Of course, we've got the big transnational publishing corporations as well, but the ones who are really, you know, convinced that more translations should be published are small independent presses, small independent publishers, and they have been defined as activists and also as cultural scouts, because they are the ones, reading from different contexts and trying to see what is published elsewhere that is worth translating. To give you just one example. And then, initially I was, when I was talking when Anissa was introducing me, she was mentioning that I am interested in the Galician, Basque, Catalan cultures and languages in the Hispanic context. And that's true, but very recently I became interested in Equatorial Guinea as well. Equatorial Guinea in Africa is an ex-colony of Spain. It's the only country in Africa where Spanish is an official language. Well, then you have Western Sahara, but unfortunately, Western Sahara has been occupied by Morocco, and it's not a state in itself. So and it was just 3 years ago when Melibea Obono, who is an author from Equatorial Guinea, was translated from Spanish into English, that I realized my activism about all these minorized cultures was lacking a post-colonial perspective. And so I integrated Equatorial Guinea, and now I'm teaching a module about that as well. So it's always about finding new areas that are worth exploring and putting together different interests, I would say.
Thank you so much. I really cannot thank you enough. It was such an engaging lesson that we all benefited from, we enjoyed, and thank you for your support, your help. Thank you for really that spontaneity, and also really insightful responses. The spontaneity is we felt like we're just talking, we're at your place and we're talking, and that is really, really appreciated. I really appreciate your time, your answers and everything. And I wanted to thank thank you, thank Ruth, thank Lamia, and everybody else who helped. Most importantly, I really cannot thank enough Dega and Lamine Bisker from Algeria. Thank you so much for our IT technicians. Thank you again, Ruth, and I really look forward to thank you, Olga, and I look forward to Ruth's talk on next Saturday. So please attend the session. It will be as interesting, and I wish you a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just to say, if you let me say a final thing, thank you for all the questions. I mean, some of the questions I feel maybe my answers were not very, very well elaborated, but they were really insightful questions, and they've made me think, and I will keep thinking about them. And if you have any particular question about, an example or something that you would like to discuss with me, please email me. And finally, I would like just to say that a couple of years ago, I created a mailing list. I think I have included it on the chat.
Perfect.
So yeah, it's a really useful strategy as well, transnational feminist strategy, so that all of us working on the topic of feminist translation studies can learn from others and can know what is going on in different parts of the world. So feel free to join if you want, and thank you again to Ruth, to Dega, to Anissa, and a very special thank you to all the participants for all your questions.
Thank you, and see you next Saturday, inshallah.
Yeah, see you next Saturday.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.